biological characteristics, a little different in terms of marketing structure. However, in 1990, again before NAFTA, we had 268,000 hog producers scattered all across this country. And just about 20 years later, 2012, we've reduced that number to 68,000. We wiped out 75% of all hog producers in this country just in the course of a little over 20 years. And the meat packers, of course, didn't say anything, did they? This was progress. And they point to the fact that, well, we've actually increased the number of hogs. We jumped from 57 million to 66 million by 2012. This is progress, the meat packers say. And they said it increased the herd size from 300 head to over 1,000 head over this period. This is progress. This is efficiency. This is creating economies of scale in an otherwise inefficient industry, which is your sister industry, the hog industry. So, you had, after World War II, for decades, we had an organization on a national level that represented the exclusive interest of producers. It was called the National Cattlemen's Association. For decades, it only represented producer interest in your industry. But then it ran into financial trouble in the 80s, and in the mid-90s, a wedding occurred. The wedding was between the National Cattlemen's Association, your organization, and the Beef Industry Council, representing the big meat packers. So the wedding occurred, and that's how we came to be called, our organization came to be called the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. No longer did it exclusively represent the interests of producers, and that's why our CAF was born 2 years later. In 1998, we were formed in recognition that there was a huge void when this marriage occurred, because no longer did the largest segment of the supply chain have exclusive representation. Now their interests were being compromised and dictated to by the far more politically and economically powerful meat packers, like the Swift & Company at the time, now JBS, IBP at the time, now Tyson, Cargill, National Beef Packing Company, Smithfield Beef Group. All of these were dictating to the National Cattlemen's Beef Association what policies we ought to pursue. So now go back to the hog industry. So the hog industry had a very similar organization, the National Pork Producers Council, that likewise has multinational meat packers seated on the governing board and influencing the policies of that organization. So they sat and told us for 22 years, this is progress. Never during that entire period did you ever hear the National Pork Producers Council say, now wait a minute, you know what? In the United States, the hog industry's most important asset are its hog farmers, because it is its hog farmers that support the rural community, that pay the taxes for the school, that purchase from the local ranch supply store and the feed store, that do business at the local bank with the local insurance company. That's the most important asset we have in rural America, are those who are out there farming and producing livestock. Did you ever hear them say that? They didn't say that because they don't care. They don't care because it's not profitable to care, and they're in the business of being multinational corporations whose only purpose in life is to satisfy shareholders. Being loyal to the United States and helping rural America is not on their to-do list. And as a result, you heard nothing from them. And folks, that's why you didn't hear anything from the American Sheep Institute either. And why you won't hear anything from the National Chicken Council. And you're not hearing anything from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Because this trend of fewer and fewer producers and more control by the meat packers is exactly the strategy that they're pursuing in your industry. So let's look at your industry. You're the last frontier. There's about 750,000 cattle producers scattered across the United States, and you're the largest segment, as I said before. You're a $70 billion a year industry. You've got 750,000 producers at the base of the pyramid here. Seed stock producers, cow-calf producers, stockers, and backgrounders. And then you move all these cattle you're producing every year, about 25 million head last year, moving them up through the supply chain, and they hit this first line, and that's our feedlot sector. The first line and the largest segment of our feedlot sector are small farmer feeders with capacities of less than 1,000 head. They only feed about 13% of those 25 million cattle. So 25 million cattle working their way up, 13% get dropped off here. The rest of them go up to the very peak here. That's the larger feedlots, capacities over 1,000 head. They feed 87% of the 25 million cattle that we feed every year, or we fed last year. Importantly, there's 73 very, very large feedlots in this segment up here that actually controls over a third of all the fed cattle. So what's happening here is your industry becomes ever more concentrated as your live animals work their way through the supply chain. And then once these 25 million cattle here are ready to be slaughtered, they're marketed to 4 meat packers that control 85% of the market. What these meat packers want to do is they want to control this supply chain, to have an orderly supply of low-cost cattle in order to slaughter here. And if the meat packers are able to manipulate the price in any way, or to distort the price of fat cattle in any way, it will harm every one of you in this room, even though you never sell cattle to a packer, because you're selling 3, 4, 5, 6 weight, 7 weight cattle to a backgrounder or to a feeder. So even if you do not feed cattle, have no relationship with the packer, this is the most important part of your cattle industry that you need to pay attention to. Because the value of your lightweight calves today is the expected future value when those animals are ready to be sold to the packer. So if they manipulate this price, we see the futures price fall, this harm will permeate the entire industry, and you will see lower prices for your calves. So this is the structure. The meat packers want to control this segment of the industry, and how do we know that? And what is it they want to do? They want to do to your industry what they have already done and perfected in the poultry and the hog industry. It's called vertical integration. Vertical integration is when the end of the supply chain controls the whole vertical structure, everything below it. This is the most important thing to know about vertical integration. Vertical integration kills competition. Vertical integration kills competition because it substitutes a command and control regime for otherwise competitive forces. The packers control it. How do we know they want to do this? 2002, we passed a ban on packer ownership in the 2002 Farm Bill. And the American Meat Institute, the largest trade association representing the packers, issued a public statement that said that barring the meat packers from vertically integrating the cattle industry would be unfair and punitive and lacks any credible evidence. They were fighting tooth and nail because they were telling us publicly their full intent was to begin to vertically and horizontally integrate this industry. And then just a few short years later, 2007, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, remember it used to be the National Cattlemen's Association representing exclusively the voices of independent producers, but now it's influenced by the packers. This is important. Here's what they told the chairman of the U.S. Senate Agricultural Committee. In order to meet customer requirements, packers must own some or all of their livestock to ensure a steady, adequate supply of livestock to the particular type of livestock to the packers. How many of you agree with that? That the only way we're going to be a successful industry is if we let those big packers begin to vertically integrate the industry by buying more and more feeder cattle and feeding them themselves. How many of you agree with that? This is what they're telling members of Congress every single day in Washington. That you want the packers to own more cattle. And they're there to help them do that. So during the time that we have allowed the meat packers to infiltrate our national organization and to begin dictating policies, we have actually been supporting policies that disfavor you, the producer. One of the chief among those was the failure to enforce our antitrust laws for decades. The Sherman Act, the Clayton Act. But in fact, the first time in decades that we did enforce it was when RCAP went and convinced 17 state attorneys general to file a lawsuit to block JBS, the world's largest meat packer, from acquiring National Beef Packing Company. 2008 was the first time the Justice Department dusted off our antitrust laws and actually blocked a mega merger in our industry. So that's why today you have 4 packers controlling 85% of the market instead of 3 controlling 90%. It's because we did take one small but important step. But that was it. Not since then have we seen any enforcement action. We've not enforced our Packers and Stockyards Act. You know that after our new Secretary of Agriculture, we had high hopes for him. One of the first things he did was he withdrew what were called the GIPSA rules, the Farmers' Fair Practices rules. What were those? Well, those were the rules that the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921 needed in order for that act to be implemented. That act said it was unlawful for meat packers to engage in unfair, deceptive, or unjustly discriminatory acts or practices against producers. And very importantly, it said that the meat packers could not engage in granting undue or unreasonable preferences or advantages to producers. Meat packers are prevented from giving undue or unreasonable advantages or preferences to producers. So what does that mean? Now think back to the chart where I said we were losing $17.40 per head per month in our feedlot sector. And I asked the question, why do we have any feedlots left? Well, this Packers and Stockyards Act's prohibition against undue preferences said that if a feedlot were to give under the table payments to one feedlot and not to another, that's an undue preference. It would have been unlawful. But take, for example, a hypothetical situation where you have feedlot A, which is a large feedlot, and you have feedlot B. And in feedlot A, the packer comes to them and says, you know, if you will commit all your cattle to me, not make me have to go out there and bid in that messy competitive market, then I will guarantee you a cost-plus contract. That regardless of what the market does, I'll give you your cost of cattle, your cost of feed, your cost of insurance. You're insulated from the market. So cattle feeder A, big cattle feeder, gets insulated from the market, but little cattle feeder B doesn't. And I say little, 1,000 head, perhaps, farmer feeder. So if there's volatility in the market, who's likely to go out of business? The small farmer feeder. We've lost 84,000 of them. What about a preferential contract where the meat packer goes to a feedlot and says, if you will commit all your cattle to me so I don't have to go out in the competitive market and bid, then I will guarantee you will never lose more than $30 a head regardless of what happens in the marketplace. It's called a stop-loss contract. So feedlot A, we have volatility in the market, loses about $60 a hundredweight. The meat packer, or excuse me, $6 a hundredweight, the meat packer comes in and says, well, here's your $30. You're never going to lose more than $30. Feedlot B isn't insulated that way. In a volatile marketplace, who goes out of business? 84,000 of our smaller feeders. What about simply a service fee? Feedlot A gets an offer from a packer, says, commit your cattle to me so I don't have to go compete for them, and we'll simply give you a $30 a head service fee for being involved in this program. And so feedlot A is insulated. If the vagaries of the market cause a crash, nevertheless, this feeder is not going to suffer the consequences of the small farmer feeder. We've lost 84,000 of them. That was the fallacy and how you have been misled about the need to pass the Packers and Stockyards Act, GIPSA rule, because it would have protected you from the unfair and unjust cattle procurement practices that are happening today. We also know there's been no action in trying to stop the meat packers from engaging in what we know are their outright efforts to vertically integrate your industry. So here's what's happening in your industry. And remember, we're focusing on the fed cattle level because what happens here will affect everything down below. So a few short years ago in 2005, in your marketing region, the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region, nearly half of all cattle in 2005, 47.2%, were sold in the price discovery market, the cash market. So those half the number of cattle were establishing the base price. That base price was then linked directly to all these formula contracts, otherwise known as alternative marketing arrangements. So what happened back here, you had 50% of the cattle were setting the base price for all the contracted cattle. Things weren't too bad. However, as time progressed, we got to 2015 during your price collapse, and in your Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region, the percentage of live cattle sold to the packers in the price discovery market had fallen to less than 3%. Less than 3% of the cattle were establishing the base price for the 97% that were contracted and linked to that base price. So, how would four packers ever be able to take advantage and exploit this situation? Well, here's what they do. You have four packers in the marketplace. They are only purchasing 3% of the cattle. You have an ultra-thin cash market. Two of the packers decide not to go into the market, and the third one doesn't bid earnestly. And suddenly you have very little competition during that week. That lowers the cash price. Lowering the cash price will lower the price on the 600,000 head that they've got contracted. And as a result, they save millions per week. $7-8 million a week just by lowering the cash market by $1. And all they had to do to lower it, they just avoided the market. They didn't add themselves to the competitive process. because there's so few of them, it causes a reduction in demand. And so here is a contract, for example, a JBS contract. It's a formula contract. It says that the base price will be the previous week's weekly weighted average Nebraska direct beef price. So all the packers this week decide to stay out of the market, drop the market $2 to $3 a hundredweight. Next week they're going to gather in all of their formula contracted cattle, and they're going to be able to tie next week's cattle to this week's depressed market, and they get to laugh all the way to the bank. So, but you've been told, that's not really what happens in this industry. Yeah, we have 4 packers, but they all need cattle, and so 4 packers makes a market. That's all you really need in America for a competition. After all, look at the auto industry. We have 3 major auto producers. Look at virtually any industry. There's a lot of concentration going on. 4 packers make a market, right? That's all you need in this industry, right? So some researchers looked at that question. University of Wisconsin in 2011, they did a study, and they said, well, what happens in a marketplace when there's a change in the supply of cattle? And their theory was, if cattle supplies get tight, these 4 packers will probably have to compete for the available cattle. But if short-term supplies become plentiful, these 4 packers might begin to cooperate. Now, we call that collusion, but the researchers said cooperate. So the theory that they found to be true was when short-term supplies were tight, the packers, there's only 4 of them, nevertheless, they'll compete. But when the short-term supplies become more plentiful, then they begin to cooperate, and cooperation will cause fed cattle prices to decline by about 9%. So we wanted to test the theorist's theory, and we looked in October of 2013. So what do we know about them? Well, in May of 2013, we started the price rally. So in October, we've had several months of increasing prices for your cattle. Why was that happening? The industry told us. Our herd size had shrunk to, at that point, about 60-year lows, and our supplies were growing increasingly tight. So tight supplies, and you were receiving, this is USDA data, you received 51 cents of every dollar a consumer spent on beef. And that dollar had to be shared with everyone in the supply chain. So the retailer got 42 cents, the packer got 7. You were the majority recipient when supplies were tight at 51 cents. Packer and the retailer had to share 49 cents. So it jumped 12 months further, 2014. What was happening here? Now supplies were the tightest in memory. And we were herd size the lowest in 70 years, tight supplies, and your share jumped from 51 cents to 56 cents. The retailer share fell 40 cents. The packer share fell 4 cents. Don't feel sorry for the packers because they're also getting the high and the awful, about 120 bucks a head, not included here. We're talking just the dollar that consumer spends on beef. So supplies are growing tight. Your share is increasing as producers. And then in 2015, what happened? Well, in the middle of the year, we heard, well, miraculously, even though it takes 3 years to rebuild the herd, you've begun overproducing, and our supplies have suddenly become, short-term supplies, suddenly became more plentiful. Your share fell only almost 10 cents, from 56 cents to 47 cents. The retailer's share now jumped to 48 cents. The packers jumped modestly 5 cents. So now you were the minority recipient when short-term supplies were more plentiful. Now jump to 2016, when your prices tanked in October of 2016. That month, you were in the distinction of receiving the lowest share of the consumer beef dollar on a monthly basis in the history of your industry. You received only 38 cents. The retailer's share jumped up to 51 cents. The packer's share jumped up to 11 cents. So it appears that when supplies were tight, the 4 packers nevertheless had to compete. And what happened when they competed? You had higher prices. And when they cooperated, that's what the researchers said, we said collude. When they cooperate and or collude, your prices fall and you sell calves for about half of what you sold them for the year before. And here's what it looks like. Here's what this cooperating looks like from a visual perspective. We're going to look at 2004. This is a chart done by Dr. Robert Taylor of Auburn University. And what he does is he tracks the live cattle prices in the green versus the volume of cattle that the packers have committed through these formula contracts. So captive supplies is what they're called. And the interesting part is, look at the relationship. Every time the captive supply level increases, your fed cattle prices decrease. Pick a spot. Every time there's an increase in captive supply numbers, your cattle prices decrease. Here's a big Y increase in volume of captive supplies, big decrease. Then when supplies got extremely tight and the packers had to compete, there was a reversal, an inverse relationship. Now when your prices were increasing, it was at the same time that the volume of captive supplies were decreasing. Clearly an inverse relationship between the volume of captive supplies held by the packers and the price that you receive for your cattle, and this is historical. In fact, this is the best evidence we have that these meat packers are manipulating the fed cattle market in order to drive the prices down to you, the US cattle producers. So that's one way we have allowed policies to be put in place that disfavor your economic interest. Another way is, we've talked about it, you can't distinguish your product in the marketplace. So what does that happen? What happens as a result? If you can't distinguish your product from among the 18 different imported products in the marketplace, you become nothing but a cog in the meat packers' global supply chain. So what does that mean? What the meat packers want is a seamless global supply chain. If they don't like the prices of American cattle, they want to be able to seamlessly, meaning the consumer is not aware of it, they want to be able to seamlessly source beef and cattle from other countries. They want to be able to source cattle from Australia, New Zealand, Brazil. Oh, you say, well, we can't do that today, right? Right now they can only get cattle from Canada and Mexico. But folks, the default position is open borders for live cattle. The only reason they're not bringing cattle in from Australia, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina is because foot and mouth disease around the world, or other diseases like parasites in Australia. Paul Englert wanted to float 5,000 head of 500 weight feeder cattle into the United States clear back in 2001. Was denied by the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service at USDA because Australia has parasites that we don't have here, and we weren't willing to introduce them. As Christina said, that's no longer the case. Now there's a higher willingness to take risks with these cattle. So while today they're putting your USA label on Mexican and Canadian cattle, tomorrow, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, tomorrow they'll be putting USA beef labels on cattle from Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand. That's why this is urgent. So you have become nothing but a cog in their supply chain so that the meat packer has all of the power to decide from what country they will source their beef. If there happens to be a disease problem in one country, they simply shift to the other. Consumer never knows the difference. They don't like paying $1.50 for cattle in the United States. They'll simply start buying cattle out of Uruguay, and the consumer will never know the difference because no longer are you a U.S. cattle producer. Now you're a cattle producer of the world. And that's what a global supply chain is, and that's why they are so vehemently opposed to country of origin labeling. So much so that even our U.S. Department of Agriculture has partnered with Kansas State University, and they did a study in order to satisfy their theory that country of origin labeling actually hurts you guys. That if we had country of origin labeling, it would cost you money. Consumers don't care where their beef came from. It's a regulatory burden on you, no return in the marketplace. There was no evidence of increased demand for beef. You do not want country of origin labeling. It is the worst thing that could happen to you for the government to mandate the program. Is there anyone in this room who hasn't heard that? So let's apply that to what happened in your industry from the time we passed country of origin labeling in 2002. Now we're looking at your feeder calf prices. This is 550 weight cattle out of Oklahoma City on a monthly basis from January of 2000 all the way to February of 2018. So we saw when country of origin labeling was first passed in the 2002 Farm Bill, you had depressed prices. Your calf prices were about $100. Fed cattle prices were about 67. Country of origin labeling was passed with expectations that it would be implemented very soon, within a matter of a couple of years. So there was expectations and your cattle prices were rising. But then the meat packers regrouped because we won cool in the first place in an upset. Meat packers regrouped, convinced Congress to delay the implementation of country of origin labeling. So we went from 2004, 5, 6, 7, and 8 until 2009 before cool was actually implemented for beef. So we had stagnant prices all the while cool was just simmering with no labeling taking place. In 2009, we had partial implementation of cool. It's because the meat packers influenced USDA and Congress and said, you know what? We don't want consumers to tell the difference between Canadian and Mexican and US beef, so let's allow the meat packers to commingle one Mexican animal, one Canadian animal in a day's production. Now remember, Tyson slaughters 28,000 head a day, so all they have to do is mix one animal in that, and the entire day's production can be labeled product of the USA, Canada, and Mexico. So consumers couldn't tell the difference, but it was partial because they could tell the difference between the Uruguayan beef and your beef and the Argentinian beef, because at the time under the Cool Law, beef had to be labeled through retail sale, eliminated the USDA's allowing the meat packers to unpackage and put your label. So we at least had partial implementation of Cool in March of 2009. Look what happened to your cattle prices. They started to march upward, trend was upward, and then we had an onslaught, an assault on country of origin labeling. Canada and Mexico, with the help of our multinational meat packers, went to the World Trade Organization, convinced the World Trade Organization that country of origin labeling discriminated against imported animals. And as a result, the World Trade Organization, you know, we elect those, right? We appoint them, you know, they're unelected, unappointed. It's an international tribunal. We ceded sovereignty to this Geneva-based international tribunal, and they told the United States, you had two choices. Yeah, you passed your law under the US Constitution, but that doesn't matter anymore. You have two choices. You will either repeal the law or you will significantly change the law. But USDA actually did something good in May of 2013. They changed the law. They changed the regulation and said, we're going to remove the loophole. From this point forward, all beef had to be labeled according to where it was born, the animal was born, raised, and slaughtered. So suddenly, U.S. consumers knew precisely what beef in the grocery store was your beef versus what beef was foreign beef. And what happened to your prices right after that? You had the strongest rally in the history of your industry. Your prices rose to the highest nominal levels in history. But then the meat packers in Canada and Mexico regrouped, worked with Congress, worked with USDA, and WTO said, no, United States, your change does not affect the discriminatory aspects of the law. You must still repeal country of origin labeling or change it. So Congress started falling all over itself that it was going to repeal Cool. Everybody knew at the end of 2014 that country of origin labeling's days were numbered. And soon after that, in June, the U.S. House of Representatives overwhelmingly, they fell over themselves to repeal country of origin labeling. Your prices were faltering at the time. This signaled the collapse. The collapse began to fall in December. The Senate followed. And after Cool was eliminated, right there, December 2015, there was no more requirement for U.S. beef to be labeled, or any beef, to be labeled according to where it was born, raised, and slaughtered. Your feeder calf prices continued to fall for another $61 a hundredweight until hitting a low in October 2016. And today, you're just barely above where we were when country of origin labeling was first initiated. So is there anything on this graph to suggest that you've been harmed by country of origin labeling like all the experts have told us? No. So does this graph definitively prove that country of origin labeling is what caused your prices to increase? Yes. Strong, strong correlation. Strong correlation between every segment where you overlay Cool on your prices. It looks like Cool was the facilitator of higher prices. Why? Because it was doing exactly what we believed it was supposed to do. It would allow consumers to choose the best beef in the world grown under the best of conditions. It allowed consumers to buy beef that was produced for its entire lifespan under the supervision of the United States health and safety regime and not some developing country. And so consumers had the choice of buying cattle or beef from cattle that looked like this, or going down in a developing country and buying these in Costa Rica. Folks, that's what country of origin labeling is about. It's about giving you the ability to distinguish your products in the marketplace, and you've all been told, oh, wait a minute, wait. All beef is beef. Regardless of where the animal was born, beef is beef, whether or not it was born and raised in Montana, Manitoba, or Mazatlan, right? Beef is beef because all the meat entering the United States meets the same health and safety standards as the United States, right? You've all heard that, right? Your industry's telling you that. They're telling Congress that. So here, just very recently, we passed a requirement upon you that if you want to feed antibiotics to your cattle, you're going to have to go to your veterinarian and pay her to give you a certification to use antibiotics, right? That's a cost of production. So, do they do that in Canada and Mexico? No. They don't do that anywhere in the world except right here in the United States of America. So isn't your product under stricter guidelines than all the other imported product? Absolutely. Why did the NFL in May of 2016 urge its football players not to eat beef from Mexico or China? Because they were finding athletes testing positive for clenbuterol, a banned substance in the United States. Folks, these developing countries do not have the infrastructure, have not made the investment to maintain production standards that you follow every single day here in the United States of America. You produce the best beef, you have a superior product, and your National Cattlemen's Beef Association and the meatpacking industry do not want you to capitalize on it in the marketplace, because it is going to cost their multinational meatpackers profits if you determine, or consumers determine, where they want their beef sourced. So, the other, we talked about it already, the other policies that we've supported that have disfavored you, we talked about the fact that we've only looked at half the equation in trade policy. Here is the same type of graph that we looked at with the North American Free Trade Agreement. Here are exports to the 20 countries that we have free trade agreements with. South Korea, Panama, Australia, Bahrain, Chile, Singapore, the Central American region, Costa Rica, Peru, Jordan. So here are our exports. And they say, look, these free trade agreements are good because we are increasing exports to record levels. They're absolutely right. But what they're not telling you is we have encouraged even more imports than we have exported, and as a result, we are accumulating a huge trade deficit in the trade of cattle beef, beef variety meats, and processed beef with these 20 countries, including the NAFTA. Cumulative balance is $47 billion. So how do we know that matters? So who cares if we're accumulating a deficit? Why is that bad? Well, we know how to measure the strength of an economy. Economists do it all the time. It's called the gross domestic product. In order to determine the gross domestic product of a nation, and you can apply it to an industry, you simply take consumption, investment, government spending, and then this formula called X minus M. Exports minus imports. So regardless of the first part of the formula, if you sell more than you buy, you strengthen your economy or your industry. But if you buy more than you sell, if you have a negative deficit, you weaken your nation or your industry. We are weakening our US cattle industry by pursuing these stupid trade agreements. But you've been told, now wait a minute, exports add about $260 per head for every fed animal we slaughter in the United States. Anyone not heard that? Exports add $260 in 2016 to every fed animal. Now here, this is a very complicated, sophisticated formula to calculate this. Here's what they do. In 2016, we exported $6.3 billion worth of beef. We divide that by all the animals we slaughtered, 24.2 million head. We come up with $260. So they're not lying to you. The exports did, in fact, they didn't add, but they represent $260 per head. But that's only half the equation. So let's apply the same formula to the imports. Well, our imports overshadowed our exports. Our exports were $6.3 billion, but our imports were $7.1 billion. So we take $7.1 billion divided by 24.2 million head, and now we have $290. So we gain $260, we lose $290, that leaves you with a negative $30 a head. Congratulations. Folks, everyone in Washington thinks you support this. Everyone. Everyone in Washington thinks you want to continue with this policy. And you've been told another thing. You know, imports really don't compete against your product. Because we import a low-quality grinding product from Australia and New Zealand. We mix it with our high-quality trim, and that's what we sell to Burger King and McDonald's, right? You've all heard that. Imports do not compete with you, they complement you. So, a couple of ways to look at that. Number one, let's look at it from Canada and Mexico's perspective. In Canada, we import 63% is muscle cuts of beef, competing directly against your high-quality product. 28% is the low-quality grinding product, which is about what we produce as well. That's from Canada. So the world's changing. other countries are now beginning to emulate the United States and starting grain feeding, including in Australia and other countries. And so that fact is no longer factual. In fact, for the last 4 years, we have imported about 54% of the low-quality product, but 48% is high-quality muscle cuts competing against yours. But here's the most important aspect. All of you sell cull cows and bulls as part of your annual operation. In fact, nationwide, the average is about 20% of your income comes from cull cows and bulls. So what do they produce from cull cows and bulls? It's a low-quality grinding product they mix with our high-quality trim in order to produce the hamburger that we sell to McDonald's and Burger King for consumers, right? So why are we supporting as an industry the unlimited influx of low-quality grinding product when we know for a fact it is competing directly against our sales, 20% of our income, for cows and bulls? Why are we supporting a policy that's shooting us in the foot every single day? And so this is the fallacy behind what the meatpacking lobby is telling you. And this is critically important. Here is a direct quote from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association in July of 2017, told to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, U.S. Treasury Department, State Department, U.S. Department of Agriculture. They said, simply put, we import cattle from Mexico and Canada to supplement shortages in our herds and to help our feed yards and packing facilities run at optimal levels. We import these cheaper cattle because we have a shortage in the United States and we want an orderly flow of cattle going to the feedlots. So why don't we have more young people coming into this industry? Why are our prices depressed? It's because we're substituting the opportunities in our industry for cheaper imported product that we are encouraging to come into this industry to displace not only our current production, but our future potential production for children like that young man who wants to be a rancher when he grows up. This is an urgent matter. And then you've been told this. Well, there's lots of things that we slaughter that come from a cow that we don't eat here and we have to ship it somewhere else, right? Like tongues. Read something where the meat industry is talking about the value of exports. They will always mention how valuable that tongue is per annum, right? Because the United States, if we didn't export tongues, we'd have to mix it up for dog food and they'd get $1 a tongue rather than $4 a tongue, right? Well, here's a chart showing the volume of tongues that the United States imports from Canada. 1,300 metric tons of tongues from Canada. Did you know we imported tongues from Canada? See, you're being misled by the meatpacking industry, because if you knew what was happening, you would stop them, which is why they call us radical. Why they do not like our cap is because we're standing in their way. So remember the sheep chart where I said this was where we had production in the blue graph since 1980, half a lifetime ago. We had the red line domestic consumption. We had the maroon as import volume. Well, this is your industry. This is the cattle industry. We don't produce enough beef to satisfy domestic demand. We've always had to import some to make up the difference, and because we do, it's a vicious circle. We eliminate opportunities to be more profitable in our country. But nevertheless, like the sheep industry, that in the mid-90s, 20% of its production was derived from imported products. In your industry today, 20% of the production of your production is imported product. So you are where the sheep industry was in the mid-90s. That's where you are today. And we need to take steps to change that. And then finally, the other issue here is you're being forced to pay a cattle tax, the National Beef Checkoff Program, that is subsidizing lobbying groups that are fighting everything I told you tonight. Everything that I have suggested to you tonight is wrong, is what those lobbying groups that are recipients of your checkoff are using to fight against you. And as Tatum said, they're using that also to fund the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So what is that? The Global Roundtable for Sustainable, everybody wants sustainable beef. That's one of those warm and fuzzies. And at the core of this is a mandatory animal identification system in which you must hire a third-party auditor to come to your ranch, certify that you are meeting the terms of production that about 100 corporations have determined are necessary for you in order to be sustainable. They will then control your supply chain with the data and the requirements imposed upon you, and all for that, they get to sell your beef with a green label on it that says sustainable beef. And you likely will receive zero. And here's how that product works. So you're paying money in this checkoff program, but you're not allowed to promote USA beef, right? It's generic beef. The checkoff program just tells consumers, just go out there and eat beef. If it's from Uruguay, it's just as good as the United States. That's the message of your checkoff program. Kind of. But here's an advertisement that said that there's growing demand for U.S. beef around the world. That there's a strong demand for U.S. beef around the world. So think about this. This is a beef checkoff advertisement, advertising how important it is to tell the world that they're buying USA beef. So apparently you're the only unsophisticated group of consumers in the entire world, 6.8 billion consumers. You folks don't understand the value of USA beef, right? That's not ironic. That's deceptive. But this is what your checkoff dollar is going to. So let's say that you want to control the cattle industry, and you want to dictate the terms of production, and you want to achieve this green label at the end. So how do you do that? You don't go to the 1.4 billion producers around the world and do workshops and teach them how to be sustainable and to follow certain practices. Nor do you go to the 6.8 billion consumers around the world and tell them, pull that product up through the supply chain. You tell the producers down there what you want. No, that's not how you control industries. What you do is you control them at what they call the bottleneck, the pinch point. And in our industry, as we saw at the top of the triangle, it's where 4 packers control 85% of the 25 million cattle we produce. So the big corporations are looking at the supply chain and the multinational corporations that control it, and from there they will begin to control your industry. So here's a list of the corporations. You've got Tyson, JBS, Cargill, Arby's, McDonald's, Costco, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Beef, and then you've got this little black and white cute panda here, WWF. World Wildlife Fund. One of the largest environmental groups in the world would like to see less consumption of animal-based protein. So this little warm and fuzzy sustainable panda is working with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and all of these to control this supply chain by doing this. Here's their goal. This is from the World Wildlife Fund. You can look at it on the website. The purpose is to bring all the big players, meaning the big corporations, bring them together to improve the sustainability of the global beef supply chain. That's not you. You're the U.S. beef supply chain. That's not what they want to do. They want a global beef supply chain so it is seamless, so the meat packer can choose from what country they want to source their cattle and beef, and they have no particular loyalties to you. Because also, you're paying $80 million a year into the checkoff program. 40 million of it is supposed to go to advertise and promote and market your beef, right? Generic beef. So that means that the 4 packers who actually sell the beef, you sell cattle, not beef, but the 4 packers that sell the beef are now receiving $40 million of your dollars to pay for their advertising to market their beef. Which means they're able to squirrel away a little money and start to build a war chest. You know what they're spending that war chest on today? They're investing in companies like Memphis Meats and Beyond Beef. You know what those are? They're building beef in petri dishes. They're building beef with animal or with plant protein and insect protein. They're trying to come up with alternative proteins to convince people to eat less animal protein and more plant-based and insect-based and petri dish-grown protein. Folks, those meat, it's Tyson and Cargill. It's the largest and 3rd largest corporations, beef packers in the United States of America, are investing money to compete directly against you. And your checkoff dollar is funding it. You are essentially funding the future demise of your industry. And here's the cute little panda is in Finland urging Finlanders to eat less animal-based protein. I mean, this is all publicly available. but your meat packing industry, the National Cattlemen Beef Association, is all working for this. So, here's just a short list of issues or pending actions that RCAF has initiated. In January of 2016, we sought a formal complaint, asked for an investigation to the US Senate Judiciary Committee to investigate what caused the collapse of our cattle prices in 2015. That investigation was accepted by our US Comptroller General, and the investigation is pending. We hope to hear the results soon. In May of 2016, we filed a lawsuit. After being unsuccessful working with Congress and the administration that are simply too close to the multinational meat packers, too close to the swamp, we went to the third branch of the government, filed a lawsuit, and said it was unconstitutional for Secretary Perdue to force Montana ranchers to subsidize the private speech of the Montana State Beef Council. Because unlike the National Beef Council, the Montana State Beef Council is not supervised directly by the government. There's no democratic accountability. We said it was a violation of our First Amendment free speech rights to compel producers to subsidize the private speech of private entities without first getting the producers' affirmative consent. So we won an injunction at the federal district court level, and as a result, in Montana, the Montana cattle producers, for the first time in 30 years, they have a choice. They can choose whether their 50 cents stays in the state that is spent to advertise North American beef for Wendy's, or they can choose to have all the money go to the national, where there is at least theoretically a democratic accountability for the money. So in that case, we won in federal district court. We have a pending ongoing preliminary injunction that's now been appealed at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The hearing was held in March. We hope to hear a decision in the next 3 or 4 months. June, we filed a lawsuit on country of origin labeling. Remember I said the meat packers, the USDA was allowing them to unwrap foreign beef, rewrap it, put your label on it, and sell it domestically as well as internationally. We said that was unlawful. We said the Tariff Act of 1930 requires all imported goods to be labeled to the ultimate purchaser, and it was unlawful for USDA to kowtow to the meat packers to allow them to steal your labels. Then in June of 2017, we learned, as you all did, that our largest beef packer in the world, JBS, who we thought was an upstanding citizen, was caught bribing over 1,800 government officials in Brazil. They were shipping tainted beef in the international beef market. What they were doing is bribing food safety officials in order to ship that tainted beef. And several of their principals in that company have been jailed for insider trading. So it wasn't quite the upstanding citizen that we thought, but we said, you know what? It's pretty clear what this company's modus operandi is. Let's make sure that they didn't do something like that in the United States. We asked the Justice Department to do an investigation of their business activities, and in August, the Justice Department thanked us for the request and said they'll get back to us. We haven't heard back yet. Finally, the last issue here, I'll skip a couple, is early this year, we discovered an example of market failure. And we've been told every time we go to Washington, there's nothing Washington can do until you can prove to us that there's market failure. In other words, where is the market, the competitiveness not functioning in our industry? And where we found it was up in Pennsylvania. JBS had a plant in Solderton, Pennsylvania. There's only one other large packer. Cargill is up there. You had 2 packers buying fed cattle and cull cows. Well, JBS had a pest problem, and USDA closed them down temporarily. When they did, cattle prices up in that area collapsed, and Cargill was out scooping up all these cheaper cull cows because there was no competition. We said, there it is. There's market failure. You didn't have enough participants, buyers in the marketplace, that all one of them had to do is close its door for a day, and you would see a collapse in prices that would harm independent producers. So we've asked the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee to do an investigation as to whether or not we have sufficient competition in the marketplace. And finally, here are what we're asking Congress and the new administration to do. Number 1, reinstate country of origin labeling to stop stop meat packers from undercutting the value of your product with cheaper sourced, undifferentiated imported product. Number 2, we need to either break up the packers or we need to regulate the packers. In any event, we have to stop the packers from exercising their abusive, monopolistic power in order to leverage down your prices. Number 3, we need to renegotiate our trade agreements so that we achieve a balance, and that so you no longer have to absorb all these other countries' oversupply problems. And finally, we've got to quit forcing you to pay for the meatpacking lobby to lobby against your interests. Those are the 4 most critical issues that we are working right now in Washington, D.C. And with that, you folks have sat for a long, long time. I'm just going to stop, and I'm going to ask Tatum in 1 minute or less to talk about our membership, and then we're going to go to questions and answers. And I don't need to be anywhere till 4 o'clock tomorrow night, so we can stay a long time for questions.